let's talk about the open source and why open source license is not enough. But first, let me ask with a little poll or test or quiz. So what is open source software? Right? What do you guys think it is? Anybody? No? Okay, yes, look at that, our wonderful volunteer.
Open source software is anyone who recommends license, executing a license in which I, in a way, with no responsibility or liability on the end consumer of what you're doing.
Okay, yeah, that's wonderful. I like open source. Avoiding responsibility is number one thing to focus on. Okay. Okay. Yes. Good. Yes. You know, use it for good and for evil, right? As a pick it up on the previous talk. Okay. Anybody else wants to say? Yeah. Okay. Look at that. We have.
I can use it to build something else.
Oh. Cool. Okay. Okay. Oh, look at that. We have such a wonderfully active audience. I thought by the end of the day, everybody will be like, whatever. I just want to have my nap instead. Well, anyway, so what I would say is what I would expect you to say, you know, not avoiding responsibility, damn it, but the open source software which matches the open source definition, such as maybe you know, had by Open Source Initiative or some other. At least that is kind of like a classic, right? We define open source software very often through the open source license. Now, what are the open source licenses, right? Actually, if you do go to the classic OSI definition, I tried to fit it up in the same slide, but actually OSI like we are lawyers, right? We like long text, so it's kind of I think like a number of pages, so it's not possible to fit on the page, but you can check it out there, right? So there is an open source definition. We have I think like 10 criteria expecting what open source is and what isn't, you know. And if you try to propose something like SSPL license, they're going to tell you, nope, that doesn't fit. Now. Have some of you heard the term of a free software? Yes, yeah, you know, of course you did, right? And if you think about like a free software, it's you know, somewhat similar. Often is kind of used interchangeably by a lot in community. Though Richard Stallman would probably disagree with you, right? But what I like about free software, they actually have a definition which fits in a single slide. Right, you say, well, you know what? We're just going to talk to you about the four essential freedoms, right? Which you know pretty much captures majority of the stuff. Again, which is focused on the license. Well, the question, though, I would ask in this presentation: is it really enough? Is it really enough, right? And when such question is asked, you probably should ask in return, enough for whom? Well, and here we have a number of stakeholders. Now, one is the open source lawyers. Any open source lawyers here? Yeah, well, you know, like one secret I'll tell you, then I'll say, Amanda, but you're open source lawyer. She's to say, no, I'm recovering open source lawyer, and there is a difference. Right, so the lawyers like to talk about the license because that connects to, you know, to IP and all this, you know, kind of just, that is their life, right, in many cases. Now, there are also other stakeholders, right? We also have a commercial open source software investors. And we talk about those. We have a also interesting perspective about open source, which in my opinion often is like, well, we like the opportunity to have a cake and eat it too, right? How can we make sure we can call something open source, but at the same time, we can prevent anybody to compete with us? Right, that is their idea of open source, right? At least what we would like to see. Then, of course, we have another important stakeholders, they're open source developers. And I think this is kind of interesting, right? Because you would see some folks talking about the open source fundamentally from this point of view, right? Well, maybe you heard about some folks saying like the open source by developers for developers, right? Anybody heard that that statement? And of course, our open source software developers are very important stakeholders because they create software, right? Without them, well, open source software would not exist. But it's also a question, create for whom, right? There is, I think, another, and I would say that is the most important category of open source software, is the open source users, which are often not developers, right? Well, last time I checked, I think there is about 30 million of developers worldwide, right? That is, pretty big number. Of course, we have a, great community, but we have what is 8 billion people out there. Majority are using software one way or another, right? And the developers are the small fraction of the whole users of a software. And I think it is very important to really focus on the users, right? If you are thinking about the impact of the open source software. If you really say, hey, how can we make the biggest impact in the universe? What is interesting, though, in the last few years, well, or maybe now decade plus, right? Well, I'm feeling old just saying that. We have rise of end user focused open source software. Now, I remember, when was it? Probably like in early 2000, going to OSCON. There was this wonderful open source conference. Anybody remember this? But it was very interesting. At that time, it was all about this kind of a very hardcore infrastructure open source software, right? Like you would say, like a Linux, Apache, MySQL, Postgres, few other things. But that was really very much, bits and pieces for building software. And then things have, transitioned where we have, software like this. We have obviously things like a Firefox, very successful open source software was mentioned during keynote today, right? But you also have a lot of small things, like there is like an open source software for astronomy, right? Or something. Right. Now, what I also want to mention here is this resource I went in the end. It's called like Open Source Alternative 2. And there's a bunch of those websites already. What is interesting is how many sort of like end user software has gotten open source alternatives those days, and how much of that is being created. Right? I mean, I would say, like, if you look at Hacker News, Product Hunt, right, or something, there is like almost every week yet another open source alternative for X is being launched, and a lot of that is not in open source infrastructure, dev tool, and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's hope or assume I convinced you what users are kind of important, right? Users are important, right? So what those users tend to value in a software from my practice? Well, users are wonderful, but they are also kind of selfish, right? And what they often focus are things like cost. Again, I think it was interest mentioned on a previous talk, right? What according to this, like a Harvard research recently published, where open source software is a lot less expensive than proprietary software, and also it's kind of push down surprise, right, for all software, right? So even proprietary software is less expensive those days compared to where it would estimate it to be if open source software wouldn't exist, right? Now, what also open source gives us is vendor lock-in avoidance, right? And some companies and some users don't really care about that, but some of those, especially in the enterprise space, who had their rodeo with Oracle or some other equally nice companies, they can say, well, you know what? If I have only single vendor, it's kind of maybe problematic, right? Because, well, they can really, leverage their pricing power, right? Whatever. Another thing I would say, which is important, is a choice in this case, right? Choice of vendors, and also where to run your software, right? Or how to run it. You would find if proprietary vendors, they can say, hey, you know what? We now want you to run our software only in the cloud, right? Or something like that, where with open source software, I have all the choices where, how to run it, right? And also I would put the customization in this case, right? With a lot of software, it may not meet our requirements exactly. As we innovate, we want software to do more. With a proprietary software, you are at the mercy of a vendor, which may say, well, you know what, we just don't like it, your ideas about how to build software, or it can be ridiculously expensive. Where with open source software, you have a choice to take it in-house, right? Or often, again, to work with vendors which may need your needs, right? So that is the needs of the users, as I can see it. Okay. So in this case, let us ask a question again. Well, if that is a need, would the open sources alone be enough, right? And in this case, let us imagine, right? Maybe it doesn't exist, but imagine how we can follow the letter of the open source license, right? But not really the spirit of it too much, right? Well, imagine what we have a project which has OSI approved license, so it's perfectly open source, but we have like some single developer who's trying to say, well, I control this repository and I don't want your changes, right? I don't like you, wherever, right? I am not interested in, making a project better or something, right? Also, that project may say to choose not to provide binaries to non-customers, right? Again, if you look at the open source, that doesn't necessarily talk about the binaries at all, right? And in general, even with GPL, well, you only have to provide the source code to those who get your binaries, right? And then also, well, I have a source code, but you know what? That is a way how to build it, kind of a separate thing, right? I don't have to disclose it. Now, I'm not going to go like in exactly the details and the kind of point fingers, but what is interesting is there are some open source projects, right, which would at least use kind of one of those kind of hostile things, right? And what I would say that what that tells us is what it's possible for projects to be open source, but not really practically usable, at least as an open source project, right? So we can say is what the open source license itself is necessary, but not sufficient for open source projects to be practically users. Right? Now, I think what is interesting about this thing, right, is what that is rather important for users. I think number of people have been trying to do a bets at the open source projects and then finding, well, it's not practically usable, right? Either it has hostile developer, small contributor team, not enough vendors or something, right? But I don't think what we are getting enough attention in the ecosystem focused on that, right? There is a lot of fights about the license. Is this or that license open source, but not really at the ecosystem surrounding that. Now, there have been some work in this case, right? Like Simon Phipps actually worked on a scorecard back in 2009, right? And I think there was even some articles you can find saying, hey, there is going to be this open source scorecard, right, proposed to OSI and became the standard, right? You can find there's like some, like this is like an interesting scorecard. He provides, right, and then he also kind of referred to maybe the open source is kind of already called, maybe we can call it like organic software, kind of similar to those kind of organic foods which are not as bad for you, right, as inorganic crap. So yeah, so that was his idea, and you can check it out, right? I'm not sure if you can like see it completely, right? But his goals were like open, meritocratic oligarchy, modern license, copyright aggregation, trademark policy, roadmap, multiple co-developers, fork and feasible, and transparency, right? These are kind of criteria. Now, before I looked at that, or actually somebody pointed this work out to me, because again, with 15 years ago, right, it was all by forgotten. I was also thinking about that and saying, hey, what exactly criteria I would put, right, for the project, right? And in this case, I actually used their kind of my assessment kind of on the PostgreSQL as an example on a 5-point scale, right? Well, in this case, right, how they're doing, right? And I have a same kind of for MySQL and some other stuff, and well, they're not doing as good as Postgres. So, like from my standpoint, what I was thinking about as a criteria, one I think is a very big one. What we saw, especially with HashiCorp, right, and others, is what the governance is very important, right? When you have a single company which is governs a project and say, hey guys, you know what? We think now it's not in our interest to continue the open source license. Well, that is kind of become problematic, right? I find also what the development model is very important, right? Because if a development doesn't really happen in a public with a community participation, right, that can be problematic, right? I also looked at the contributors, kind of similar to where Simon has, right, is in terms of making sure there is a broad base of contributors. We don't just work on one community, right? Some of you may have been on my panel earlier today, and I mentioned is what the MongoDB was not forked, well, because all the contributors actually worked for MongoDB, and addition to that had a very kind of strict non-compete agreement, right? So who would fork it, right? Another thing which is important, of course, is a very broad user community, right? In my opinion, if you have a project, right, which nobody really uses, there is a very high risk, well, frankly, it's going to die. And you know what? Even if it has kind of contributors, with no users, people tend to use interest, right? Typically, open source developers don't want to work on the stuff that doesn't matter, right? And that is the user communities which keep it motivated. The vendor community is another one, right? It is kind of like strange for open source, but if you, what I was thinking about Postgres in particular, one of the key reasons why it is so successful, why there is this kind of PostgreSQL event happening probably like every week somewhere in the world because there is so many vendors, right? So many small companies actually making money on Postgres, right? And those people have more resources, more motivation to contribute to the project success compared to just volunteers, contributors, right? And I would always look at that. I would also think that is very important because of what we speak about the choice. A single vendor means no choice, right? And that really gets us in a very similar situation like Oracle. Well, licenses, obviously, I talk about accessibility, right? And that is, well, of course, packages, but also different ways how you can install the software, right? We can think about those cases like, hey, you know what? Is it available on Docker Hub? Is it included in Linux distributions if that's appropriate, right? Is it easy to deploy from the different cloud vendors? And again, that's a very interesting example where with, like, for example, Postgres is available elsewhere. Something like MongoDB, right? We say, well, you know what? It's only available from those vendors we chose to pay us the ransom because the license we use, well, it's actually non-competitive, non-open source license, right? Even though they try to promote MongoDB or sometimes try to promote themselves as an open source database. Well, and there are some others you can see here, which I think are reasonably self-explanatory. So with that, I actually wanted to ask you, right, is, what do you think? If there's, let's say, something missing, or you can say, well, you know what, Peter, we think that's, entirely unnecessary for open source software to be practically useful. Yeah, so what do you guys have to say?